In 20 years of judging talent, Simon Cowell had seen everything. Singers who forgot their lyrics, dancers who fell mid-performance, magicians whose tricks failed spectacularly. He'd pressed the red buzzer thousands of times without hesitation, his face a mask of professional detachment. But on this particular evening in London, something happened that no one in the Hammersmith Apollo expected. A moment so raw, so human, that it stopped not just the show, but time itself. The stage lights blazed in their familiar red and gold pattern. The audience of 2,000 buzzed with anticipation. Simon sat at the judges' table in his signature black V-neck shirt and dark jeans, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Beside him, the other judges chatted casually during the commercial break. Everything was normal. Everything was routine. Until Michael Patterson walked onto the stage. He was 63 years old, with silver hair cropped military short and a posture that spoke of decades of discipline. He wore his old Royal Marines dress uniform, the dark blue fabric pressed to perfection, medals gleaming under the stage lights. 7 medals, each one representing a story most people would never understand. Michael had arrived at the theater 4 hours early. He'd sat in his car in the parking lot, engine off, hands gripping the steering wheel. His wife Sarah had driven with him from Portsmouth. 3 hours of mostly silence. She knew what this meant. She knew that her husband hadn't sung a single note since their son's funeral, that he'd spent months working up the courage to even submit the audition tape. In his jacket pocket, folded carefully, was a photograph. Thomas, at 18, in his own Marine's uniform, grinning at the camera on his passing out day. Michael had touched that photograph at least 20 times in the past hour. A talisman. A reminder of why he was here. The audience applauded politely as Michael positioned himself at center stage. His hands trembled slightly, something that hadn't happened since his first day of combat training 40 years ago. The host walked over with a microphone and a practiced smile. "Welcome to Britain's Got Talent. Tell us, what's your name and where are you from?" "Michael Patterson. I served in the Royal Marines for 32 years. I'm from Portsmouth." "And what will you be performing for us tonight?" Michael's jaw tightened slightly. For just a moment, the military composure cracked, revealing something beneath: pain. Deep, old pain that had been carried for too long. "I'm going to sing a song," he said quietly. "It was my son's favorite." The word "was" hung in the air like smoke. The host's smile faltered slightly, but professionalism kept him moving. "Wonderful. Whenever you're ready." As the host walked off stage, Simon leaned forward slightly. Something about the way Michael stood, the way he gripped the microphone, caught his attention. This wasn't nerves. This was something else entirely. The backing track began. Soft piano notes filled the theater. Michael closed his eyes, took a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his lungs, and began to sing. His voice was untrained but honest. Raw, it carried the weight of sleepless nights and unanswered prayers. He sang a ballad about fathers and sons, about time running out, about words left unsaid. And as he sang, tears began streaming down his weathered face. He didn't wipe them away. He didn't stop singing. He stood at attention, as he'd been trained to do for 3 decades, and let the grief pour through the music. The judges' table fell silent. The casual chatter stopped. Simon's arms slowly uncrossed. His expression, usually so controlled, began to change. His jaw tensed. His eyes fixed on Michael with an intensity that the cameras caught in perfect detail. Simon Cowell had built a career on being untouchable, the man who couldn't be moved, who saw through every sob story, who valued talent above all else. But something about this moment, about this man in uniform singing through tears, bypassed every defense mechanism he'd constructed over 20 years in television. He thought about his own father, Eric Cowell, who had passed away years ago. The conversations they never had, the things left unsaid. Simon's hand moved unconsciously to loosen his collar, suddenly feeling the weight of the studio lights, the heat of something he couldn't quite name. By the second verse, Michael's voice was breaking, not from lack of ability, but from the weight of what he was carrying. The audience sat in absolute silence. 2,000 people holding their breath as one man's heart broke in real time under the stage lights. He was 19, Michael said suddenly, stopping mid-song. The backing track continued for a few notes before the sound engineer cut it. The silence that followed was deafening. Michael looked directly at Simon, as if the other judges, the audience, the cameras, none of it existed anymore. My son, Thomas. He wanted to audition for this show 3 years ago. He was too nervous. I told him he should do it anyway. I told him he had time, that we'd apply next year. Simon's hand moved to his mouth, a gesture so unlike him that the other judges glanced over in surprise. He didn't have time, Michael continued, his voice steady now, military training overriding emotion. He was killed in Afghanistan 7 months later. He was a medic. He died saving 3 of his mates. The audience gasped. Several people in the front rows brought their hands to their faces. But Michael wasn't looking at them. He was still looking at Simon. This was his song. He used to sing it around the house. Drove his mother mad. A brief, painful smile. I promised him at his funeral that I'd do this, that I'd come here and sing it for him, because he never got the chance. Simon stood up. Not slowly, not with hesitation. He stood up as if something inside him had broken through every professional barrier he'd built over 2 decades of television. Without a word, he walked around the judges' table. The other judges watched in stunned silence. One of them reached out as if to stop him, then pulled back, recognizing that this moment was bigger than format, bigger than production schedules. The audience didn't know whether to applaud or stay quiet. The cameras followed Simon as he crossed the stage, his footsteps echoing in the silent theater. In that walk from the judges' table to center stage, something shifted in Simon Cowell. Later, he would struggle to explain it. It wasn't pity. It wasn't performance. It was recognition. The recognition that he was standing in the presence of something sacred. A father's love, undiminished by death. A promise kept despite unbearable pain. He stopped directly in front of Michael Patterson. For a long moment, neither man spoke. They simply stood there, 2 men who understood loss in ways that couldn't be explained, only felt. Simon could see the military training in Michael's posture even now, the way he fought to maintain composure. And he saw something else. He saw himself. He saw every person who'd ever buried their emotions deep enough that they thought they'd disappeared. He saw the courage it took to let them surface. Then Simon did something that in 20 years of judging, he had never done. He embraced Michael. Not a polite hug for the cameras. A real embrace. The kind that says, without words, I see you. I understand. Michael's military composure finally shattered completely. His shoulders shook as decades of carried grief found its release. Simon held him, one hand on his back, and said something that the microphones barely picked up. He'd be so proud of you. The theater erupted. But it wasn't applause. It was something bigger. 2,000 people standing, many of them crying, bearing witness to a moment that transcended entertainment. This wasn't about talent scores or golden buzzers. This was about a father's love, a son's memory, and the courage it takes to stand in front of the world and let your heart break. When they finally separated, Simon's eyes were red. He placed both hands on Michael's shoulders and looked him directly in the eye. I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear me, Simon said, his voice rough with emotion. What you just did, coming here, keeping that promise to your son, that's the bravest thing I've ever seen on this stage, and I've seen a lot. He turned to the audience. Thomas Patterson died serving his country, saving lives. and his father just honored him in the most beautiful way possible. He looked back at Michael. You didn't just keep a promise. You showed us all what love looks like. Simon walked back to the judge's table, but instead of sitting down, he pressed his golden buzzer. The stage exploded in gold light and confetti as the audience roared their approval. But Simon wasn't finished. He removed his watch, an expensive piece he'd worn for years, and walked back to Michael. He placed it in the veteran's hand. Time is the one thing we can never get back, Simon said quietly. Your son's time was cut short. But what you did tonight, you gave him more time. You made sure his memory, his love, his music, it continues. That's immortality. Michael looked down at the watch, then back at Simon, unable to speak. The host, tears in his own eyes, stepped forward to wrap up the segment, but Simon held up a hand. One more thing, he said. He looked into the main camera. If anyone out there served with Thomas Patterson or knew him, I want you to contact the show, because we're going to make sure his story is told properly. And Michael, you're going straight to the live shows, no question. The audience's ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes, but in all that noise, in all that celebration, the most powerful moment remained the silence between two men on a stage. The moment when a judge stopped being a judge and became simply human. After the cameras stopped rolling, Simon stayed with Michael for nearly an hour. They talked about Thomas, about loss, about the weight of promises kept. Production staff who had worked with Simon for years had never seen him like this, completely stripped of performance, of persona. Just a man connecting with another man's pain. Michael showed Simon the photograph he'd been carrying. Thomas in his uniform, that bright smile, those young eyes that would never age. Simon held it carefully, as if it were made of glass. He asked about Thomas's childhood, his dreams, the little things that made him laugh. And Michael, surrounded by the empty theater and the crew quietly packing up equipment, talked about his son as if he were still alive, as if speaking his name kept him present. Before Michael left that night, Simon gave him his personal phone number, not through an assistant, not as a formality. He wrote it himself on a piece of paper and pressed it into Michael's hand. Call me, Simon said. Anytime. I mean that. Michael Patterson never made it to the live shows. His health, already fragile from years of service and the toll of grief, declined rapidly. He passed away 4 months later, surrounded by family. But in those final months, he received over 10,000 letters from people who had watched his audition. Veterans, parents who'd lost children, people who simply understood what it meant to carry grief with dignity. Simon attended his funeral, not for cameras, not for publicity.